Wow, thank you. And yes, home. So I'll just say a couple of things here. First of all, it's so over the top. I don't really know how to respond other than uh, that. Yes, it all started for me at the New School. It was and still is the most exciting place to study economics. And Anwar Sheikh, I took a mere, I can't remember, it was 5 classes or 6 classes with him. So when his amazing book came out and people are all going through it, I kind of said, I already know all that. That's what he was teaching, and it just took him a long time to get it down on paper.
Yep.
So yeah, it's great to be here and with so many friends, including my classmate Paul Altisman, who is, I guess, and Nancy Breen,
Nancy,
another classmate. So that's great. And actually, I've been, I'm at Tonak as a classmate who is now a colleague here at UMass, and Peter Arno is a classmate that I've been doing work with on Medicare for All. Jeff Johnson was a classmate who became a major union leader, and the stuff I'm doing now in California on the Green New Deal came out of work with Jeff. So yeah, a lot, a lot of connections. Anyway, let's get on the subject. So I think this one is the right one. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'll go through this paper that actually literally just got published a couple weeks ago. It's part of a volume on industrial policy edited by Hajin Chang, Christopher Kramer, Richard Kozel Wright, and Arkibi. I can't pronounce his last name, Akwabe, but he was the main editor. Anyway, so it's a very valuable big book on industrial policy. And if I can advertise another, the short version of some of it is in this little book that also just came out with my obscure co-author, Noam Chomsky. So that's what I'm going to talk about. If I can get this thing to work, let's see. Okay. Well, let's just start with things you already know, but it's good to put them out there. Anu just told us briefly how severe the climate crisis is. So I'll just review some basic points. I think we can start with the October 2018 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I think is fair to say was alarming, even for people, staid academic policy people who don't tend to put out alarming statements or documents, but this one was. Because they said that the previous target for climate stabilization was to hit a 2 degrees Celsius path of above pre-industrial average. The pre-industrial average meaning around 1800, so that the global mean we could allow to rise to 2 degrees Celsius above that pre-industrial level. But the October 2018 IPCC report said, no, our new research shows that we need to be at 1.5 degrees Celsius, not 2 degrees, which is a lot, right? That's a 25% reduction. And saying that if we are unable to hit that target, that 1.5 degrees stabilization target, we face these intensifying risks in terms of heat extremes, precipitation, droughts, sea level rise, biodiversity losses, with consequent results on health, human livelihoods, food security, things we're already seeing, except they're going to get a lot worse. So what happened this last year, year before, with intensifying impacts are going to get worse. Okay, so what this IPCC report said is that to get onto a climate stabilization path so that we could at least hit this 1.5-degree target, we have to reduce emissions by 50%, CO2 emissions by 50% as of 2030. That's 9 years from now. 50% emission cut by 2030, and we need to be at net zero emissions by 2050. So what I'm going to do is this talk is organized around designing a path to hit those emission targets and what it would take. So just to give some sense of what we're looking at here, I just gathered these from the internet. Look, so 2019, second warmest year on record. And as you can see over here on the lower left, we're already at 1.15 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So the IPCC says we have to stop at 1.50. We're already at 1.15. Okay, and that's why they have such stringent emission reduction targets. And this shows us in terms of the global conditions, region by region, the color coding, the heaviest red is warmest temperatures on record. The kind of midway between pink and the heavy red is much warmer than average. So you can see that almost all parts of the Earth as of last year, this year actually, this is June 2020 to August 2020, are experiencing either the warmest season on record or much warmer than average. This shows us the time series. So when we talk about pre-industrial levels, this was the global temperature anomaly relative. So this is the average up until 1930. We start to see temperatures above the pre-industrial average here around 1940, but not consistently. Really only in 1980 do we start to see this trajectory of persistent increases above the global pre-industrial mean, such that here we are as of 2019 at, well, there 1.0 was the value for the whole year. And as I just showed you, 1.14 was the figure that was reported in that meteorological study. Okay, now here's the thing that I think actually is the most frightening. So here's where, you know, the world is. These figures say 2015, but actually these are 2017. This is CO2 emissions globally. So it's about 32 billion tons. Now, if we look at the biggest model that's doing energy projections and emission projections is that of the International Energy Agency in Paris. So they say they don't do a projection to 2050, they stop in 2040. So this is their furthest out projection. They say that if the world proceeds more or less as we are right now, according to current policies, emissions are not going to go down at all. Okay, you know, the IPCC says we have to be at a 50% cut by 2030. They're saying by 2040, if the world proceeds as we are now, we will be at 40 billion tons, which is 8 billion more than where we are now. Now, this is actually the most frightening thing right here, because the IEA, their International Energy Agency model, this is what they're calling a new policy scenario. And their new policy scenario is basically incorporates all the agreements that were established in the 2015 Paris climate, the historic Paris conference, which, as is advertised, is supposed to have been the most dramatic measures globally taken on behalf of moving the world onto a climate stabilization path? And the answer is it is the most dramatic, but it is pathetically inadequate relative to the challenges put out by the IPCC. So that according to the IEA's new policies model, and we could call it the Paris model of the world, emissions still go up. Emissions are still going up from 32 to 36 billion tons as of 2040. Now we know, of course, Trump got us out of the Paris Agreement. Biden has promised to get us back in on day one. That's all to the good, except it is nowhere close to being adequate. So what I just show in these two bars is the IPCC's target for 2030, which is 16 billion tons, and net zero by 2050. And again, we're not even on the right path to get there. So what do we do about it? So basically, I think, it's analytically, it's all pretty simple. The economics are pretty simple, and the financing, the policies is pretty simple. The real challenge, of course, is the politics. So the core of the policy that I think can get the world to hit the IPCC emission targets really consists of these two basic features: dramatic increases in investing in energy efficiency across the board, buildings, transportation, industrial production, and massive expansion in clean solar energy. And when I say clean solar energy, I mean solar, wind, geothermal, small scale hydro, and also low emissions bioenergy. By dirty renewables, I mean high emissions bioenergy, which is most of the bioenergy that is being used now. In other words, corn ethanol in cars for liquid fuels, burning wood for heat and cooking, as is done in most of the developing world. That is bioenergy, but it's dirty bioenergy. It generates emissions roughly comparable to coal. So what I want to show you is, according to my rough calculations, it would take about 2.5, that should say 2.5% of global GDP per year to build up the high efficiency and renewables to the point at which we can hit the emission reduction targets. Right now, investments in clean energy and efficiency are at about 0.5% of global GDP. So we need to raise it by 2 percentage points. Now, the other part of the story, which I won't focus on, which is also not as important, but very important, is in the areas of reforestation and organic agriculture. If we break down total emissions, 70% come from energy, either burning fossil fuels or producing fossil fuels. 30% comes from deforestation and industrial agriculture. Deforestation because trees absorb CO2, so when you chop down the trees, they don't absorb. Organic agriculture because industrial agriculture depends heavily on, primarily on nitrogen fertilizer, which emits greenhouse gases. So those two sources are about 15% each, and the other 70% is energy. So the first thing we have to do in addition to the positive program for investing in clean energy is to stop burning fossil fuels. So the program that I'm going to sketch out entails building up the clean energy system, dramatically raising energy efficiency, and then collapsing the fossil fuel industry down to zero. And really, the total elimination of fossil fuels, if it's done incrementally, right now, the global consumption of fossil fuels, I'm going to speak in terms of quadrillion British thermal units, which are called quads or QBTU. It's an easy way to think in terms of energy units, it's unified. And if we think about it, 1 BTU is, you light a match and you burn it to the till it singes your finger. That's 1 BTU. The U.S. runs on about 100 quadrillion BTUs. The world runs at about 550 quadrillion BTUs. Okay, so right now, the world, 475 quadrillion BTUs are from burning fossil fuels. And we got to get it to zero. So if we just stretch it out and in an absolute way, that means we have to cut 15 quadrillion BTUs per year. And that's what we have to do. So in the first years, it's the percentage cut is small, 3.2% now. Over time, as our base gets smaller, then the percentage increases. But it is not an overwhelming problem if we think about, at current levels, a 3% cut. So that's the basic program. That's it. And but I want to also say that this is a program that actually is supportive of expanding job opportunities, egalitarian growth. That's why I think we can call it a Green New Deal, to capture the sense that it's an egalitarian program. I don't agree with the so-called degrowth school exponents. I'm not going to get into it. If people want to, I'm happy to, but I don't think we have to think about this idea of contracting overall activity. A lot of things are going to grow massively. For example, renewable energy, while other things degrow to zero, for example, fossil fuels. And so it's important to be much more specific when we talk about this overall program for climate stabilization. Okay, so let me talk about the what constitutes the clean energy parts of this investment project. And I list out here these 3 possibilities in addition to the 2 that I focus on, which are energy efficiency and renewables. So what about natural gas? It's often touted as a bridge fuel. So it is a fossil fuel, but it is cleaner burning, supposedly, than coal and oil. And in fact, it does. When you combust natural gas, the emissions, the CO2 emissions, are 40% less than coal. So that's the argument, that it is a cleaner burning energy source, and therefore we should support it as a bridge fuel. And if you watch the last debate between Trump and Biden, Biden popped out with this idea that, oh, well, maybe we want to move away from fossil fuels. And then Trump seized on it and said, you mean you're going to eliminate fracking in Pennsylvania? That means you're going to lose the election. Well, it didn't turn out that way. But in fact, generating fossil natural gas from fracking has this other impact, which is that fugitive methane leaks in production. And when you get methane leakages at even 5% of total production, that is going to increase the impact. Greenhouse gas impacts is then being worse than coal. So natural gas is not a part of the clean energy solution at all, in my view. What about geoengineering? And there's a lot of talk about this, and it's being supported by Bill Gates and so forth. So geoengineering, the biggest component of that is carbon capture and sequestration technologies. And there is carbon capture technology that works perfectly, and that's called trees. So carbon capture through reforestation and organic agriculture, as I just discussed, is a perfectly viable, important source of climate stabilization and emission reduction. But the artificial carbon capture technologies, they are at various stages of development, but there is no evidence yet that they can work at commercial scale. And this is after decades of trying. So given that we need to be at a 50% emission reduction in 10 years and basically have the whole thing settled within 30 years, waiting around for carbon capture to be the new solution is extremely risky. On top of that, the technology itself, the most well-developed way thus far to do carbon capture artificially is literally capture or liquidate the carbon once it's generated by burning fossil fuels, and then transporting it underground and storing it underground indefinitely. If the carbon leaks, then you're back where you were before. So it is not a safe technology. The other way that carbon capture technology is being developed is to reuse it, to convert it to a liquid fuel and reuse it as a liquid fuel for transportation, for example, aviation. That could yield some benefits, but again, we're very far away from knowing whether that's going to work, how well it's going to work. Nuclear, a lot of support for nuclear because it generates electricity without producing any greenhouse gas emissions. But nuclear has the familiar public safety and environmental issues associated with it, which I won't go through in any detail: radioactive waste, storage, meltdowns, and then political insecurity issues. So those are all there. And you could say, well, okay, fine, but there's problems with all the other sources. But nuclear, we know it can work. And what people often say is that it's cheap. But actually, it's not cheap. The statistic that I'm citing from you now, 30% more expensive than renewables in the US, that figure comes from the US Energy Department under Trump today. If you look up their assessments on what they call levelized costs of electricity, nuclear can't compete with solar. And nuclear is, on a rising cost curve, and solar, as I'll show you in a minute, is on a dramatically falling cost curve. So I don't really see the advantage, given the problems that we already know about with nuclear. I don't see the advantage of it. I mean, I think we can argue that, okay, we can let the service lives of existing nuclear power plants work themselves out, but not to build it out. I'll just cite again from the World Energy Outlook model. One of the things, the World Energy Outlook, the International Energy Agency, they argue in behalf of nuclear as one of the solutions, the clean energy solutions. But they also make an interesting point, saying that, well, electricity is going to cost more if we don't incorporate nuclear into the mix moving forward. But what they say, and they're trying to make an argument on behalf of nuclear, what they say, according to their estimate, if we don't incorporate nuclear into the overall electricity mix moving forward, then consumers will pay 5% more. That's not that much. So if we really think that there are serious problems with nuclear, as I am one of the people that happens to think that, if what we're sacrificing is 5% increase in electricity costs in order to build a clean energy system without nuclear, I think that is a price worth paying. Okay, let me talk about the two sources that I do want to focus on. And by the way, I know this is the new school, so people should feel free to interrupt, raise questions, denounce, whatever you want to do. Whenever. I will not be surprised, much less offended. Okay, but let me talk about energy efficiency. So what I'm showing here are what we call energy intensity ratios, and I'm measuring it. It is the ratio of the total amount of energy divided by GDP. Energy being measured in quadrillion BTUs or quads, divided by trillions of dollars of GDP. And so this index, its world average is 6.6. But what I want to show you is there is a range, a significant range, so that we go from Germany is at 3.5. The United States is 40% higher, 40% lower efficiency, in other words, than Germany. Or if you compare countries at comparable levels of development, Brazil and South Africa. Brazil is at 1/3, it's at 3 times the efficiency level, 1/3 the intensity, 7.2 versus South Africa at 20.3. So I'm going to propose that we invest heavily in energy efficiency, and I'm going to show you some data that I think can plausibly show that over the next 30 years, the world can get below what the current level is in Germany, 3.5. That the world can actually get to about an efficiency level of 2.0. Which, by the way, again, to cite the International Energy Agency model, they're actually saying that that is a viable outcome under what they call, remember we had their current policy scenario, which was a disaster. We had their Paris scenario, which was a disaster, but they did also present a sustainable development scenario. And under that sustainable development scenario, exactly, we move to a world where our energy intensity ratio is about 2.0. Okay, but how much does it cost to get energy intensity down? And I'm looking at various studies here that look at it from different angles. So this was a study from the World Bank, which took individual projects looking at investment costs in 11 countries, and it was about $2 billion to achieve 1 quadrillion BTU of energy savings. Then we go all the way to a National Academy of Sciences study, which estimated for the United States 30 billion or 29 billion per quadrillion BTU for investments in building efficiency, transportation efficiency, industrial efficiency. And then McKinsey, which has done a lot of work on this, though unfortunately they don't show us how they got their results very well. But anyway, they did an estimate of throughout the world, and they estimated 11 billion quadrillion BTUs. So we have a wide range, obviously, from 2 to 30. What I'm going to assume for the purposes of the simple model, I'm going to assume that on average, a global average of $20 billion per quadrillion BTU of saving is going to be our average cost. And I think that is a reasonable number. A lot of the differential in these costs is due to labor costs. Developing countries are obviously going to have much lower labor costs. And then there's also the issue of, marginal cost increases where you start out with the low-hanging fruit, and then it's more difficult to achieve efficiency gains. On average, I think a reasonable number, therefore, is at about 20 billion per quadrillion BTU savings. Okay, so then the second pillar of the investment project is renewable energy. And so the critical thing here is the cost trajectory for renewable energy. So what you're looking at, these are figures from the International Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA, it's part of the UN. And these dots, each dot is an individual project, and we're looking at costs in US dollars. And these are, 10 cents, 20 cents, 30 cents, 40 cents. And this is onshore wind and solar. Let's just focus on those. So, and then the shaded rectangles, those are the costs for fossil fuel electricity. So what you see, first of all, with onshore wind is that onshore wind, almost all the projects, and certainly on average, These are the average, these are auction prices for onshore wind, and then the actual cost estimates, levelized cost of electricity are the blue dots and the blue lines. Onshore wind is at the low end of the fossil fuel. So onshore wind is somewhere 6, 7 cents. Fossil fuels are between 5 and 15 cents. Now let's look at solar PV, which is the most prevalent source of solar. As you can see, solar PV has come down dramatically. This is a big part of our story. Solar PV has come down dramatically just in the last 8 years. So that right now, solar PV is also fully competitive with fossil fuels. It wasn't in 2010, but it is now. It's in fact, right now, if we're looking at these average auction figures, solar is also at the low end relative to fossil fuels. So, we can build out a clean energy system. Okay, maybe we have a little bit of nuclear as a residual, but basically on a foundation of energy efficiency and renewable that is going to be the foundation. And in terms of, there's no sacrifice in terms of cost, because the energy efficiency investments pay for themselves over time. By definition, you use less energy to achieve a given level of service. And our main sources of renewable energy are at cost parity or lower than fossil fuels. And then finally, here's this other calculation. Now, this is not from the International Renewable Energy Agency, but again, this is from Trump's own Energy Department. This is a document that the Trump's Energy Department put out this past February. By the way, the Energy Department, nobody's allowed to put the words climate change even in a memo, but they do put out this quite valuable document on levelized costs of electricity. And so they show the full set of costs at any given time, annual flows. What I did was convert those annual flows, because they break it down into capital costs, the transmission costs, operations and maintenance, and so forth. So what I did was I took their annual capital costs and converted it into lump sum. And so these are the lump sum costs by the U.S. Energy Department for building out 1 quadrillion BTU of energy capacity, solar, onshore wind, bioenergy, geothermal, hydro. And you can see, it ranges somewhere between, 150 billion, and solar is at the low end at 97 billion. And here's just a weighted average, just to scale it for you. Weighted average with mainly solar, 50% solar, and these others. We're at $109 billion to build out a quadrillion BTU of clean energy. So remember, I'm saying it's $20 billion to get savings of quadrillion BTU through efficiency investments. And it's going to be about 110 billion to get gains through building out renewable energy. So those are the key findings, except what I want to do now with the model is say, okay, the number is 109 billion weighted. I'm going to double it roughly. I'm going to say, let's assume that it costs 200 billion to build out 1 quadrillion BTU of energy, renewable energy, solar, wind, bio, geothermal, and hydro. Okay, so those are the foundations of the model. And I can just go through the model very quickly. It's extremely simple, and you've already got the main features. And all I do here, the same International Energy Agency model assumes a 3.4% average annual global GDP growth rate. So I'll just take that exogenously. Then I just project out global GDP. So global GDP under that assumption is going to be 260 trillion in 2050. It's 86 trillion now. And a midpoint in 2035 is going to be 178 trillion. Okay, and now how much, how do we get our energy savings? So as I said, the International Energy Agency's sustainable development scenario assumes that essentially we can stabilize global energy consumption at the level it's at now, at a flat rate. In fact, actually reduce it modestly, reduce it at 0.3% per year relative to current levels. Now, to do that, you have to get our energy intensity ratio down from its current level of 6.6, as I showed you, to 2.0. And that will require investments in much more efficient building technology, better insulation, better windows, heat pumps instead of traditional heating, ventilating, air conditioning systems. Yes, electric cars that run on renewable energy, and better yet, public transportation, combined heat and power systems in industrial efficiency so that you capture the heat that is generated initially by running machines. Those are the things that we're talking about. And what happened? I can't move this. Okay. Okay. So, so the question is, how much does it cost to essentially stabilize global efficiency, global consumption at the current level? So, based on my assumption of a $20 billion per quadrillion BTU, I simply take the difference between running the global economy at 6.6 intensity level, getting it down to 2.0 intensity level, that is the international agency's level. And what happens is we end up with the world consuming 512 quadrillion BTUs of energy versus 1,716. And then the costs, I just multiply by this difference, the energy savings, which is, as you can see, 1,204 quadrillion BTUs. I just multiply by 20 billion, and that means that it's going to cost $24.1 trillion, or roughly $900 billion per year to get to that 2.0 level of energy intensity. Okay, so then the next thing is, if we have 512, the global economy is consuming 512 quadrillion BTUs of energy, and that's how much we have to supply. I'm going to assume we have to supply it through 100% renewables. Maybe we don't. Maybe we can have some not fossil fuel, nuclear. Maybe we could even have some fossil fuels through carbon capture. But I'm taking the strong case that we have to do it through solar, wind, hydro, small scale hydro, geothermal, and some low emissions bioenergy. We already have 26 quadrillion BTUs. That means we need to get to 486. Again, I'm assuming that it's going to cost $200 billion per quadrillion BTU, which, as I showed you, is almost twice as much as what the Trump administration is saying it now costs to expand renewable energy. So when you do that, 200 billion per QBTU with 486 QBTUs to go, that's going to cost $97 trillion. So roughly 100 trillion, and divide that, we're at a little less than 4 trillion per year. That's how I got that's the whole model. And this just summarizes it. This summarizes the cost figures I just showed you. And the midpoint GDP on my assumption of a 3.4% growth rate is 178 trillion. Multiply, so we have the 891 billion per year in efficiency, 3.6 trillion in renewables. That's 2.5% of GDP. That's how I get the 2.5% of GDP. It's very, very simple. It's probably a high-end estimate because, as I said, I inflated the renewable energy number, almost doubled it. I inflated the efficiency number. So this I would regard as a high-end figure. It's not that far off from other people's models. I know it's not the same as Lance Taylor's model because Lance wrote and told me that. I already knew it, but we have a disagreement, and I'm willing to obviously take very seriously what Lance said, so much so that we hired Lance's student, Gregor Semenuk, as part of Perry now. So anyway, I think 2.5% of GDP is probably a somewhat high-end estimate. Okay, now how do we pay for all this and how do we implement it? So I don't have a lot of time, but I will just do this quickly and I will end on that. If we just to simplify things more, talk about the first year of the program. And by the way I laid out this investment project, I'm assuming that, realistically, we're almost in 2021. Nothing is really going to happen big time until 2024. We're going to plan a lot of things. We have to do a lot of organizing. We all have to listen to Greta Thunberg and wonderful young people like her. And hopefully by 2024, the message will have sunk in and we will have launched the project full scale. So therefore, I'm assuming that it's really effectively a 27-year investment cycle, 2024 to 2050. So year one is 2024. And in year one, 2.5% of global GDP is 2.6 trillion. So and we break it down. The clean renewables is 2.1 trillion and energy efficiency is 550 billion. Energy efficiency is, as I said, is by far the cheapest way to reduce emissions, by far. It's 20 billion versus 200 billion, roughly speaking. So we want to start with all we can get in terms of efficiency, but that's the breakdown. It's 2.6 trillion. Now, how do we finance it? So just as a heuristic exercise, I'm assuming that we're going to divide total spending half public, half private. It could be otherwise. I don't think there's any plausible way we can say it's going to be a lot more in terms of public, even if we want it to be. I'm not sure I want it to be. I mean, as it is, 90% of the global fossil fuel assets are already publicly owned. So let's not assume that just converting things to public ownership are going to yield good results. But okay, so I'm going to assume 50% public, 50% private. So that means we need to raise 1.3 trillion in public funds in year one, 2024. And I'm just, again, this is a heuristic. You could come up with other sources and other ways, but I'm assuming that we have four basic sources of funding, public funding. We have a carbon tax, or we can call it something else, a save the earth tax, whatever you want to call it. It's a carbon tax, but we need to take the revenue from the carbon tax and return most of it back to people, because otherwise we'll see their living standards go down. We saw what happened in France last year, the Yellow Vest movement, where Macron said we need a carbon tax to save the planet. The people revolted. They said, we want to save the planet. We also want to pay for groceries. So he had to withdraw the carbon tax. It was a disaster. So what I'm proposing is a carbon tax with 75% of the revenue returned to everyone on planet Earth as a rebate. It ends up being $60 per person, the way I designed it. And 25% of the revenue will go toward the clean energy investment, and that's 160 billion. A second source is cutting military spending. So yes, I mean, we can obviously make the case that global security depends on climate stabilization. We could take way more out of the military budget globally. I'm suggesting 6% as something that actually could be politically feasible. That gets us another 100 billion. A third source, I would, I would say debt monetization, or, central bank, the Fed and the European Central Bank basically just buying up green bonds issued by governments, issued by municipal governments, state governments, federal governments. And I'm suggesting that at 300 billion. It's not the whole Megillah like modern money theory would have us do. We can discuss that, but it is a nice chunk. And it's actually consistent, not so much with what's coming out of the Fed, but the European Central Bank, they already said that they want to engage in climate risk financing, and this would be an easy way for them to do it. And then finally, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuel subsidies are at about 3 trillion. But like with the carbon, if you just eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, that's going to hurt low-income people, because most of what actually goes into fossil fuel subsidies is keeping the price of fossil fuel energy down for low-income people. So I'm suggesting that we eliminate the fossil fuel subsidies, all 3 trillion, but we only take 25% of that to use it to finance. And that's how we get our 1.3 trillion. So that's half of the financing. And then the other half, private, is going to be based on policies to incentivize private investors. So one of them is governments buying clean energy from private producers. Procurement. Secondly would be the regulatory structure. So yes, we can have carbon taxes, as I just suggested. I would argue more efficient is what are called renewable portfolio standards, which is a fancy way just saying that you have hard limits. So that you say for utilities, cut your fossil fuel consumption 5% per year, every year, every utility in the world. Cut it 5% a year, or else the CEO goes to jail. How about that? Or you pay a $100 million fine. Something that really matters. I mean, in New York, we have renewable portfolio standards, but they're not binding. Nobody bothers to even check whether they're fulfilled. So it's fine to have them on paper and for Governor Cuomo to make speeches, but we actually have to have them binding. So, and then finally, subsidizing the clean energy investments. Feed-in tariffs, these are just long-term fixed contracts, forward contracts, so that as an investor, and by the way, I should declare an interest here. I myself am a very small scale clean energy capitalist. So I actually am in this world a little bit. And I know, having these fixed long-term contracts is very, very important. Why? As we know, it eliminates risk. It enables you to get your financing. And so I do financing mostly for nonprofits, but basically, we try to arrange for getting the solar panels on the roof, and we sell the electricity to the nonprofit so that we can benefit from the tax benefit from the production tax credits. But I need to know what how much I can sell the solar energy for, and that's basically what a feed-in tariff is. And then low-cost financing through development banks and green banks, which means combining with the macro financing at the level of the central bank, and then the development banks issue these green bonds at 0%, maybe 50-year maturity, or consols, no maturity. And that's basically the project. And I think so we get 1.3 trillion there and 1.3 trillion through the public. And this becomes, I think, an entirely reasonable kind of proposition analytically. I was going to talk about impacts on jobs and various other things, but given the time, I think I'll stop here and we can discuss these other things as you wish. Okay, thank you all very much. And nobody even stopped me. That is maybe a first at the new school, but I will stop. And
Well, actually, because I warned everyone not to interrupt you. So
but
that's a
well,
new
so
policy we
whoever
have.
listens